we're going to have some housekeeping items. Please silence your cell phone. Most of you know, but in case someone here is not familiar, the restrooms are in Memorial Hall next door, and there's some, you go out that door through the gazebo, and in the back corner you'll see a sign over the door to direct you to the restrooms. And if you're visiting with us, if you'd like more information about our church, we have a trifold brochure in the back, packed full of information about KPC. There, Janet just held them up. There you go. I'm going to start with the early church history, because this is not, the church we're in today is not the original church. Our church was founded by a group of cotton planters, mostly from Middle South Carolina, who came here in 1854, throughout the, well, even through the end of the 1850s. They brought with them enslaved people who did the work on their plantations. One of the plantation homes still standing is the historic Hale homestead right down the road to the west of us. And that is the 1856 house of Thomas Evans Hale and his wife Esther Serena Chestnut Hale and 14 other 15 children. That house is open for tours on the weekends. Just to the east of it was the Thomas Chestnut House. They were also founders of the church with the Hales. And there's a rare photo of it that, and you can see it looks very much like Thomas Hale's house right next door. And then more to the east of Thomas Chestnut's house was Edward Hale's house. So right along Archer Road here, you had these 3 family plantations, and then there were another 4 plantations up between Jonesville and Alachua. Those are the senior Hales, Serena Hale, Serena Chestnut Hale, I'll say, on the left, and Thomas Hale on the right, and 3 of their 15 children. The church was, they started with an organizational meeting in 1857. And you can see in attendance were Thomas and Edward Hale, Thomas Chestnut, John D. Young, Dr. W.H. Stringfellow, Eli Ramsey, and Dr. Robert Stewart, and others. In the fall of 1857, Dr. Stringfellow went back to South Carolina. They were from the Chester, South Carolina area north of Columbia, and he recruited a minister that he knew of, Reverend Dr. William J. McCormick. And so here are some photos of some of our church founders. Thomas Chestnut, Edward Hale, there's another picture of Thomas Hale, and there's a photograph of Dr. Stringfellow that came from the Stringfellow family. This is a photo of the original church. The church was completed in 1859, and it's along, it's maybe, what, a mile to the east of here, where there's a Orange Blossom Prep. If you go north on Southwest 63rd Boulevard, it dead ends, and on the right, you'll see the cemetery. But that was the site of the original church. And it sat there, Southwest 63rd was part of a road that went from Micanopy up to Fort Clark and then over to Noonanville, which at the time was the county seat. And so these originally started as military roads that connected forts. So the church was formally organized with 12 members, and Dr. Stringfellow and Joseph Scott were the 2 elders, and no deacons. And that church is no longer standing, as you know. It fell into disrepair during the Civil War. A number of these men were volunteered to serve in the Confederate Army. And we continue to find artifacts from the original church. So this is Dr. McCormick. He lived from 1821 to 1883, and he ministered to many congregations, but he came first to be the minister of Kanapaha Presbyterian Church. He started a congregation in Micanopy in 1859, First Presbyterian Church downtown, which is a much larger church than us. We're really the mother church. It started as a branch of this church in 1867. Wakahuta, there was a congregation there, but that eventually moved to our church and is known as the Bethlehem Presbyterian Church, but it really started in Wakahuta. And then in 1886, that was significant. If you know, there was a railroad that ran from Cedar Key to Fernandina Beach and went right along Archer Road here. And there's even a little hidden in plain sight vestige of the railroad between the two Mentone entrances. There's, next time take a look, there's near the Bray Trail, there is this big long rock, and it's definitely not a natural rock, and that was the Kanapaha siding where they would pull cars off. But nobody knows what it really is. I mean, we know what it is, but just somebody whizzing by on Archer Road is never going to guess what that was. But the population growth was moving west, and it still is today in Alachua County. And a new depot was being built, and it was around where Southwest 75th or Tower Road hits Archer Road. So that was the new depot, and it was going to be called South Arredondo. To the east, where that military road that had the original church on it, that was the Arredondo stop. That was the big stop. That's where the post office was. But in 1886, they created this new depot. And the congregation thought, well, we want to be near the new train depot. So they bought some land. And this tells you in June of 1886, and they bought an acre for $50. If only today we could do that. So it was called South Arredondo. Now, even though only because it was southwest of Arredondo, and it must have created a lot of confusion, people getting off at the wrong place, because a year later they renamed that depot Kanapaha. The cornerstone, they built a church, this church. The cornerstone was laid on June 26, 1886. And we know these details, so you're going to see a lot of details. We know these details because Serena Hale kept a diary. And she was a very active member of this congregation, so she gives us all these little insights as to the building of this church. So you'll see those along the way here. Now I'll start with the steeple. On the far left is a picture of this church with its original steeple. And then, I believe it was in the 1940s, they had to replace the steeple, probably from storm damage. So they put the shorter, I'm not an architect or anything, but the short, stumpy steeple on it. And then in 2001, a steeple that was pretty much identical to the original steeple was put on, and that's the steeple we have today. So much of this sanctuary is original. We'll start with, I mean, these are a good set. These windows right here, if you look at the hardware on them, we have a real mixed bag of hardware on the windows these days. There's another original one right over there. Those are the original latches. And if you look very carefully, you can see it real well over here. In the window casing is a sash weight and the ropes. So that's what controlled the window, you know, going up and staying up, and the windows coming down. They're contained in the casing. And with those windows, you see the red stained glass around them. The women of the church made ice cream and sold it in order to raise money to buy the red stained glass windows and sconces that were in the church. And this is a Serena Hill quote here. Rachel, who was a daughter-in-law, and Julie B., that would be Breedlove. They were members of the congregation. We're making custard for ice cream. Tonight's festival for church lamps. The festival was a success. They raised $16. Other original features, the scissor trusses. The pews are original, but in fact, these are identical to the pews that are in Bethlehem Presbyterian in Archer, which was built 2 years before this church. This church had originally a central aisle, so there were 2 sets. This is a full set here, but at some point, I'm not sure when, the session decided to make 2 aisles. So they took one of these and cut it in half. And that's why we get 2 aisles. Originally, there was just one central aisle. And the kerosene chandelier above you, that is the original 1886 chandelier. It's a kerosene chandelier. Thankfully, these days, we don't put kerosene in it. I think there was 1 year kerosene was in it and people got headaches from it. No surprise. But it is rare to have all those, most of the original reflectors in a chandelier that old. And we light it on Christmas Eve. That's the only time. And there's an interesting view of the base of the pews. You probably see me sitting in church looking all over the place. I'm looking at all these features, but the base of the pews have that very interesting carving in them. And of course, you just heard in church the bell ring before when we get started, and then after. That is the original bell. We had years ago Pastor Dawn Conti. She went into the belfry for me and took pictures of the bell, and there it is, and it's got its original maker stamp on it. It was made by the Henry McShane and Company, Baltimore, Maryland, and the date is still on it, 1886. So that is the original deal. And Carroll Hale, the 15th of the Hale's 15 children, he told his granddaughter when she was a little girl that he was proud to be the first person to ring the bell when they started having services here. Now, this is something many of you haven't seen. Years ago, we had this carpet replaced. And I knew they would take up the old carpet. So I came over to see if we had original floors under there. And there are your wood floors right there. And pastor came over and somebody else, and we looked at the floors, and we were so tempted to stop the replacement of the carpet. But it had been donated. The money to purchase the carpet had been donated, and you can see the new rolls of carpet sitting there above the stairs. So it was a little late in the game to pull the plug on new carpet. And there are ways these days to address acoustical issues that if you just had a wood floor. But there you go, there's your peek at the floors underneath. Then Kaylee Beal over here is advancing the slides for me. She and I are both of the church history and cemetery management elders. And I used to come over here and I would find shards of glass from the stained glass windows. But I was always too chicken to go underneath the sanctuary. And if you know Kaylee, things like that don't bother her. She took out a putrefied, what was it, a wrecked possum that was under the church because the odor was wonderful. And so in my quest for this glass, She crawled under there, and in doing so, she found a half of a doorknob. And that's the half of the doorknob, but it's very significant because it's called a Bennington knob, and it is identical to the knobs that are in the Hale homestead today. So that's what you would have seen on the doors of this place, is the Bennington knobs. But that was just a really cool find, I thought. The Bible over here. For years it was in Memorial Hall. And one day I asked about it because it looked like a very old Bible. Well, we were like, well, let's just take off that beautiful heavy glass casing. And guess what? That Bible is an 1886 Bible. And in the middle, most of these, when you see an old family Bible, that's where they wrote births and deaths and things. Not of this one. This has like essays in the middle of it. It's kind of strange. But anyways, not what I expected to find, but this is probably the original Bible they used when the church opened. Then we have some hand-me-downs over time. Some really old stuff that came out of First Presbyterian Church. Not the one today, but the one that was demolished in 1954. That First Presbyterian was built in 1890. And we were the beneficiary of something really nice. The earnest workers window behind us. And what you may not realize, there are hinges. So at some point, those pieces opened. There's also a dedication plaque
behind the chair.
over here.
It's behind the chair.
Behind the chair, anyways. But, so you don't have to move the chair and look at it. There it is. And it's a dedication in memory of Robert Chandler Taylor and Nancy Ray Taylor by Roberta Taylor Pierce. Those are, what relation to you, Kaylee?
Aunt Roberta is my great-great aunt. And
Yeah.
she donated, or the memory of Robert Chandler Taylor and Nancy Ray Taylor both died very young. Mr. Taylor committed suicide at the age of 16, and Nancy had polio that went undiagnosed. So my Aunt Roberta, wanted to donate that memory of those two. They died so young.
And the Taylor house was right across the road here, that brick house that Kaylee grew up in. This is a postcard I found of First Presbyterian Church when it had these windows in them. And they had multiple windows like this, by the way. So I don't know if that's the specific earnest workers window or another one. This pulpit here came out of First Presbyterian Church, and underneath this banner is a dedication to Reverend McCormick. In memoriam, Reverend William J. McCormick, 1821 to 1883, founder and first pastor of this church. And so that did apply to First Presbyterian too, remember. The baptismal font here came from First Pres, and that has a dedication on it to Julia Eliza Stringfellow. And this is a picture I got from a history elder at First Presbyterian Church. This is a picture of the pulpit and one of these chairs behind me. These three came from First Pres. But this picture is of them in First Presbyterian, in the old 1890 church. So just a little timeline. In the 1946, 47-ish, the membership dwindled, and the church closed. But by 1948, it came back. Then in the early 1950s, this is when the furniture was acquired from First Presbyterian. Okay. And this was a newspaper article I found about, it was March of, well, the article came out, I think it was February 26, 1961. It's basically saying the final services were that day for Kanapaha Presbyterian Church. The congregation decided to move closer to town, and where Butler Plaza is today was an airfield. In fact, Debbie Butler is supposed to, there's a state historical marker written for Stengel Field. It was an airfield that was there. For some reason, it hasn't happened yet. But at any rate, they bought this building from University Lutheran, and so they met there, and this place was just sitting here. To the point where there was an infestation of bees in the belfry, and it was written that the honey was dripping down the walls there. In 1970, the congregation decided to come home. So with help from a donor, the building was moved here, and it is McCormick Hall. And then a major restoration began. Heating and air was put in here, thankfully. Electrical wiring, and some carpet. Now, in 1973, in November, some major vandalism occurred here. And one article said just about every window in here had some sort of damage on it. Those are the shards of glass I was picking up several years ago that had been busted out of the sanctuary. And what Kaylee's pointing to, that is an old Polaroid picture of the damage to the earnest workers window. You can see all the holes it had in it. So some of the damage was more easily repaired, but that was a different story. So they had to start a fundraising effort to get this window repaired. Then we had more excitement here at Kanapaha. I believe it was 3 church members, probably elders, and Pastor Herb Parsons on a Sunday evening were coming out of church, and they encountered an armed robber. And the man was armed with a knife and a gun. So one of the elders was shot and one was stabbed. And Reverend Parsons ran into McCormick and called the police. The man was eventually caught. I believe he had been released from a mental health facility. But nonetheless, when he was put on trial, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison for the crime. What he really wanted, he wasn't asking for money from the elders, he wanted their car keys. As I said before, the steeple was replaced in 2001, and in 2012, we had our state historical marker dedicated. It's right out here. It's the same text on both sides. It was a big, it was a big event. They had a lot of folks come out. There were some people playing parts. Who was there? I was there as a visitor. I wasn't a member. Tom was there, and Joanna was there. So it was a really wonderful day to get the significance, the historical significance of this church documented in the state of Florida and locally. And then our beloved pastor here, Pastor Michelle, was installed, and I sat too far back when I took pictures. I think that's Tom's, the back of Tom's head was in just about every photograph I found. So I'm not that good with Photoshop, so Tom, I left you in there. And also our church is somewhat unique from a lot of churches in the area, is that we have a cemetery. That's about 4.5 acre cemetery. It's where we do the annual Easter sunrise services. And there's the White Cross there. The oldest dated burial was 1867 with the 19-year-old son, the eldest child of Thomas and Serena Hale. But since the church was constructed in the 1850s, very likely there are earlier graves there that simply are unmarked, and we would never know who was in the grave and when they passed away. Now this is a different version of the early church. This is a photograph that was donated to us by Evans Hale. And I was in his living room one day, I was working on a book, and so we were going through a family photo album, and he tossed this picture at me. He says, "You can have this." And it's our original church, but this one has a horse in it. There's the horse. And then we had this scanned very, very high resolution, and we were able to see the gate on the Hale family plot. And the other thing on the other side of it said that the church had been in the middle of a cemetery. So for years I had heard different theories about where the original church had stood. There was one former member who told me it was by the eastern boundary of the cemetery, which didn't make sense to me because if you don't know, there's a lake on the other side of the fence. And the reason the Hales left South Carolina was due to flooding. So it didn't make any sense to me that they would have constructed their beloved church right next to a water source that could flood. So that didn't pan out for me. I sort of thought it was closer to the western boundary because that's where that old road was. That made more sense to me, but I wasn't right either. This church finally gave us the answer. It was in the middle of the cemetery, so it would be to the north of the White Cross. There's a big open area. Now you'd think I would have figured this out a long time before that. The big open area in the middle of the cemetery. And in fact, we found a piece of a lock there, and after decades of rains and what have you, I saw something shiny there and I picked it up, and it was a piece of very thick glass that had transluced. So I found some more, and I took it to my friend Jay Reeves, who's a local historic preservation architect, and he did the obvious. He put the two pieces together and they fit like a glove. So they were like this. That was glass from the sconces that were in the original church. And it's since found a lot more of that glass. So it's very distinctive, thick stuff. And there's the Hale family plot. At some point in the early 1900s, I don't know when that specific wall was built, but I found something, I think it was in the Hale archives, that said that Judge Taylor, Robert Fenwick Taylor, had the latest version of the walls put in. And that's the Hale family plot. Caleb, if you back up one. You see these graves, they're sitting up high, they look like boxes. The deceased is not in the box. Those are called box tombs. They're actually in the ground, and those containers are filled with lime rock. And that was to keep animals away and potential grave robbers. And in the corner of the Hale family plot, in the southwest corner, is the burial plot of Bennett Kelly. Bennett Kelly was enslaved by the Hales, brought with them to Florida from South Carolina in 1854, along with his mother and father, Edmund and Charity Kelly. Bennett was, his job was to work inside the homestead, probably taking care of the younger children. Generally, enslaved people who worked inside the house were closer to the family. and Serena Hale hired him to work on the property, the farm as it was called then, in 1883. And then in 1884 she had one of the cabins for the enslaved people taken down and reconstructed out back of the homestead for Bennett to live in with his wife. And this is when, right before Serena Hale's death in 1895, she reportedly told the family that because Bennett was so close to the family, he should be buried in the Hale family plot in the Kanapaha Presbyterian Church cemetery. Now, Bennett did not die until 1933, but yet he was still buried in the Hale family plot. Bless you. And we think his second wife, Daphne Kelly, died only 3 weeks after Bennett. And there is an unmarked grave in the vicinity of Bennett's grave that very likely is Daphne Kelly. Also within the Hale family plot is Judge Robert Fenwick Taylor. His parents owned a plantation called Osceola in Marion County, and they went bust and they ended up moving up here. He was married to the eldest daughter of the Hales, Millie. And he was a local attorney, and he eventually became a judge, and then he became he was appointed to the Florida Supreme Court and served as Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court for 3 terms. And this is Judge Taylor, completely different Taylor. And that's Kaylee's, what time grandfather?
Third great-grandfather.
Her third great-grandfather is buried there. Also came from South Carolina, but it was in more of a western part of South Carolina. Then we have the Ramsey enclosure. Ramseys were important to the church because Moses Ramsey deeded land for the church in 1859. In 1903, Thomas Green Ramsey found another deed. I believe that was the land for the cemetery. When Kaylee and I first joined this church, we had done a joint event called the Heart, Home, and History Tour. We were with the Homestead, and we partnered with the with KPC, so we did this 3-location historical tour. It started at the Homestead, went to the cemetery, and then ended up here. And then I think it was the next day we came to church. But at some point we went to the Easter sunrise service. And for those of you who know me know that I'm frequently in cemeteries. I'm a cemetery preservationist also. And we could just sit there and see that there were many unmarked graves just from our seat in the cemetery. Very obvious rectangular depressions facing east. That's a giveaway. So we raised money from the congregation to hire an archaeological firm, Search Inc., and had ground penetrating radar done. And that came up with 33 unmarked graves. And that was only, we really could only afford to do the wide open areas because it is an active cemetery. So we wanted to be sure these days if somebody's buried that they're not coming in, we're not digging on somebody else. And after that, we hired a surveyor who took the data from the GPR survey and combined it with his survey. And then it created this map. And we had an elder at the time who was familiar with AutoCAD. I think he worked in the architectural management division of the University of Florida. His name was Dan, and so he did the plots for us. So we have a whole map of the plots, and I've gone in there and given them unique identifiers. So we know today how to locate a specific plot. Although it's not an easy thing to do, but we can do it. We also raised money from the congregation and others to buy unknown granite markers to go at the head of each grave. And we have a very generous congregation, and O.T. Davis Monument Company, O.T. Davis himself, gave us a 50% discount. So you just saw the back of my car the day I picked up a bunch of them. I was hoping I wouldn't get stopped by law enforcement because I would have to do a lot of explaining. So at first we dedicated a few of them, and then the final markers were dedicated. We also did an All Saints Day Cemetery tour. We did that a couple of years ago now. We did it a few years in a row, then gave it a rest. So we'll probably do that periodically over time. So, Kanapaha Presbyterian Church. Learning, living, and sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. And we are rooted in history and relevant for today. Any questions? If you think of something later, you can just shoot me an email. Warren Thomas maintains our webpage, and he has a page that's just devoted to the history, and it's much more in-depth than what I just presented to you. So take a look at our webpage. It's a lot of detail. So thank you for coming. Oh, wait a minute. Vera?
Yeah. You said you had a lot more details, but I came in '68, which some of y'all know. And at that time, the building back here was at Strickland's house. Jackie Strickland, I met him before I met my husband before at club. And the building was down there, and probably you remember it was down there at their house. So you could put a Miss Strickland and Miss Chestnut were in homemakers here, and I came to the homemakers group.
It was Bonnie Chestnut, right?
Yeah. And so, but as you said, when we got married, they wanted you to have a church here.
Right.
And I was trying to remember when the windows were damaged, because I was here at that time.
Yeah, it was in, what did I say, 73?
And I remember Herb Garber, and I remember the pastor Herb.
Parsons.
Yeah, I remember him. He didn't have a wife, and so when we had homemakers group, he'd show up for lunch.
Oh, good for him. Okay, Kim.
Can you speak any more to the Ernst workers? And I look at this window every week, and I'm always
It's,
curious.
I found little pieces in the old Gainesville Suns,
Okay.
and it was a Presbyterian women's club.
Okay.
That's the best I could get
So,
from it. The dates, I'm not sure the significance of the dates, other than 1883 was when I can't think of his name. McCormick died, thank you.
okay.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's, it
Or
was
1960.
it was created then, that was their origin, I just don't know. There wasn't a whole lot of paper other than when they had their meeting dates. Okay, any other questions? Tom?
Not so much questions, just maybe an additional thought. My understanding is, Pat, maybe you can elaborate, but I think your sons were involved in bringing back the cemetery from William McCrone, and then Mo and Teddy Rancourt got involved in an awful lot of work to bring the cemetery back to where
Yeah, the cemetery, Kaylee and I went through all of the old session minutes and scanned them all, by the way. And they go back to what, the 1950s?
1952 is the oldest record we have.
Right. The real old records were burned in a fire. It is our understanding that somebody took the records home in the early 1900s and their house caught on fire and they jumped out, but our records burned up. But yeah, so beginning in the 1950s, we can tell there was this pattern of the cemetery really being neglected. And then somebody from a family who has people buried there, like the Sheffields, for instance, they would come to the session meeting and they would say, you gotta clean up the cemetery, it looks terrible, whatever. So there'd be a cleanup day. And then the cemetery would be all cleaned up, and then over time it would happen again. And I think it was the early 2000s, maybe something like that, ballpark, where a number of people, I guess, Pat, maybe your sons were involved. And the Rancourts, you remember, many of you remember Mo and maybe Teddy. They put some really hard labor from themselves, but also some financial resources behind the cemetery. So pretty much it's been maintained over time. And we're grateful for generous donations that enable that to happen. But yeah, that we've heard stories from descendants of folks that are buried there. There were times that they told me that, you know, those metal funeral home markers, over time, there used to be like an index card in there with the name and the dates and then a piece of glass. Well, those didn't wear well after a few rains. So pretty much, you know, the glass would fall out. So there'd be these empty funeral home markers. And you don't know who it's for because all the information is gone. All right. These folks told me stories where there'd be a cleanup and people would say, oh, this is in the way of the mower.
Yeah.
And throw it over the fence. I was in a cemetery yesterday morning doing a cleanup down in Micanopy, and there were many blank funeral home markers. And it's sad because, I mean, that is the only thing that marks the spot of a grave, unless you can afford ground penetrating radar or cadaver dogs. They're being used more. So yeah, our cemetery has been continuously taken care of, I think, since the early 2000s. Pat?
Do you have documentation or anything about where the Corner Hall was located near the university before it was moved out to Strickland's area?
The only thing I've seen in an article it referenced, it was by Stengel Field. So I think Stengel Field.
Yeah, that's you're right, because that's what Terrace said, the Stricklands lived out there. Yeah. So, and I went to church there. But we looked at the tax records and talked to her kids and find out where it was originally, where their house was. I remember I saw it, I was there. It was, their house was here, and this was off to the side under a big tree. So we can find out, talk to them and find out exactly where it was and put a clock. And one of my best friends, my mind is going wrong.
That's okay.
Told me about apparently they had a connection with the church, and so we can find out where it was.
Well, you know, in my mind, the fact that it was somewhere not here, Stengel Field, it's on the, not Celebration Point side, but in the Butler Plaza side. And when they finally do that state historical marker, it will be near the site of Stengel Field. So we'll be in the vicinity of that.
You can put it they lived close to Stengel Field, but it was on down, and maybe where Best Buy, but don't quote me on it.
Yeah, I've also read it was along Archer Road. Pat, did you want to say something?
Well, what I was asking though was, they bought the building from it was moved from in town to the Strickland side.
Okay.
But before then, according to my brother, who was born in 1890, that house was south of kind of where the stadium is now.
Oh, well, okay.
South of University Avenue, in a neighborhood in there.
Okay.
And she and my dad lived in it. It was a 2-apartment house at that time.
Well, it makes sense because University Lutheran is along University Avenue there by the across from the university.
But I definitely, I know she told me that when it was moved out there and then again here, because she was still living when McCormick Hall was even moved.
So it makes for a nice church office.
Yeah.
But if you can imagine that as being the place where they had services. I read where it just didn't feel like church. You know, especially when you bought this place. So, all right.
Charles Bauer,
Excuse me?
Charles Bauer.
Okay.
Yeah, friend, they lived over here, spoke at my husband's services. So we can call him and find out whether he knows exactly where it was or not, because he told me.
Okay. All right, thank you for that. So, thanks for coming. We have some cookies and water, maybe?
Other light refreshments.
Yeah, other light refreshments are over there in McCormick Hall. So, thank you.
Pick up your
Yeah, don't forget your coffee.